We've talked about how evolution is the keystone of biology, explaining both the unity of life, the fact that we all come from a common ancestor, and also the diversity of life. So we can put this all together with this idea of speciation. Speciation is the creation of new species. So when members of one species, when they can no longer successfully reproduce with one another, then they've become two different species. So we've gone through speciation. There are two major types, allopatric and sympatric. So allopatric is when there's a physical barrier separating the two populations, and then sympatric is when there's no barrier. So we'll look at how speciation occurs. Speciation occurs when there's reproductive isolation. So when there's no more gene flow amongst populations. And we can divide reproductive isolation into pre-zygotic and post-zygotic. So think pre, before the zygote is formed, post, after the zygote is formed. When we talk about pre-zygotic reproductive isolation, it's a result of barriers, which prevent the species from actually mating with one another. These barriers, okay, so we're talking about barriers, may be behavioral, such as the wrong mating dance or the wrong mating song. So if a flamingo is walking around and sees this egret doing its mating dance, let's say this is a male egret right here, okay, doing his fancy little mating dance, and a female flamingo might be like, "You're crazy, I'm not going anywhere near you," whereas a female egret would be like, "Ooh, that's a beautiful mating dance, I'm going to come on over and we're going to mate and pass our genes on to the next generation." The barrier may also be geographical. Okay? So think about the Grand Canyon separating species of squirrels, or islands, rivers. An example here of a beetle, one type of beetle lives in sandy soil, another type lives in loamy soil. They're never going to be reproducing with one another. Or populations that live in very different ecosystems. Okay? Those are geographical barriers. And our third type of a prezygotic barrier would be physical, and that's just where mating is not going to be possible. So an elephant and a mouse, obviously not, but then we can think about there are species that reproduce, some have internal fertilization versus external fertilization. That's a physical barrier. Post-zygotic isolation means that there can be some sort of mating, but it's not going to be successful. So one example would be when there are no viable offspring. So the offspring don't live long enough in order to reproduce. So a bullfrog, over here on the left we have a bullfrog, and then here's a leopard frog. There's no prezygotic barrier to prevent them from reproducing. So they can reproduce, but the embryos will only develop for a short time and then they die. It just doesn't work out. Another example of postzygotic isolation is when the offspring are sterile. Best example of this would be mules. A female horse has 64 chromosomes. A male donkey has 62 chromosomes. They can reproduce. What you end up with is a mule. A mule has 63 chromosomes. It's a great farm animal. Do a lot of wonderful things, transport people around, so very functional. That's why people like mules. But mules cannot reproduce themselves due to their odd chromosome number. All of this speciation, okay, we can also use the term adaptive radiation to describe speciation. Adaptive radiation is also known as divergent evolution. So diverge, think two roads diverged, famous Emerson poem, right? So they split apart. Opposite of convergent evolution, which we looked at in the last video. So there was a common ancestor, right? Common ancestor down here, and then there are variations that exist, and the environments might exist that these different birds live in. So there's a common bird ancestor. It spreads out to all of these different regions, and then due to the environment, due to selective pressures, due to reproductive isolation, these bird populations become less and less similar to each other over time, and eventually they can no longer successfully reproduce with one another. They're brand new species. In terms of how speciation occurs, there are two different viewpoints. The first and more accepted, generally speaking, by scientists view is gradualism. And this is the idea that selection and variation kind of happen all the time. These little small variations accumulate, and there's kind of always changes occurring. The second viewpoint is punctuated equilibrium. So think equilibrium, right? Everything's staying the same, and then punctuate. You suddenly change something. This is the view of punctuated equilibrium really stems from the fossil record, because we don't have a complete fossil record. We never will, because a lot of organisms don't leave fossils behind, and fossils are only left under certain geological conditions and environmental conditions. So we don't see necessarily every single little small change happening. Okay? But we see kind of all of a sudden, oh wow, here's a brand new species, and then 2 million years later, oh, another new species. This image right here kind of shows the two things. So punctuated equilibrium, like we have this butterfly that we're starting off with, and then all of a sudden, boom, we have this one, and boom, we have this one. So we get these different variations. And then gradualism, if you look at these, they're slowly changing over time, slowly changing over time. So that would be gradualism, which again is the more likely way that speciation is occurring. So through all of these changes that occur in all of this speciation over millions and millions and millions and millions of years, we end up with all of the diversity of organisms that we have on Earth today in our 6 kingdoms that we'll be looking at. And then we talked about earlier in this year the 2 bacterial kingdoms of Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. And then we have all of our eukaryotic organisms, the protists, fungi, plants, animals. Okay? I want you to think about this. Looking at this tree right here, this tree of life, animals are right here, this tiny little branch. So even though we are very centered on ourselves in biology and in life, keep in mind that we are a very small portion of all of the organisms living on Earth today.